There's less of a story than there would be, I think, had someone tried to kill a left-leaning president for I'd say the fourth time. 20–30% of the population probably would be pretty celebratory if Trump were killed. Trump's become almost a devil symbol for the American left. He is the evil leader of the other side, and I do think that's a risky place. And part of what makes this disturbing is that many normal people, as I just said, are becoming extremely radicalized about electoral politics. If you read the manifesto, which I forced myself to do, I've read a number of these shooter manifestos in my teaching or consulting role. One of the things that comes to mind is that he's using language directly from the Epstein files and even from the mainstream media. It's pretty clear how he got quote-unquote radicalized.
Hello, welcome back to the Brendan O'Neill Show with me, Brendan O'Neill, and my special guest today, Will Reilly. Will, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back on. We need to work out what's happening in your country, the great United States of America. It always looks a bit confusing and crazy to us Brits and other people in Europe, so it's good to get a voice of reason and some common sense. And I guess the thing to talk about to begin with is that your president, Donald J. Trump, is still alive despite an unprecedented third attempt on his life. What has been the fallout from the events at the White House Correspondents' Dinner? Is it still a big story in America? Is there amnesia around it already? What's the discussion like?
Well, there's less of a story than there would be, I think, had someone tried to kill a left-leaning president for I'd say the fourth time, actually. The Iranians apparently had a plot against Mr. Trump as well. But I mean, obviously, we saw the famous shooter on the sloped roof. We saw the man who literally camped out in a duck blind on Trump's golf course and was discovered by luck, almost by the Secret Service. And now we saw this guy, the interracial Caltech scholar who was taking selfies before attempting to kill the president and wrote this sort of Reddit tier manifesto about his actions. I do think obviously this was the front page of most media in the USA, although it wasn't for the Times. But I do think that they're moving on a little more quickly than would have been the case had someone showed up with a shotgun and attacked Joe Biden. But it obviously all Americans are aware that this occurred, and as you said, it's a remarkable series of these attacks on Trump.
So the kind of moving on from it, it's extraordinary to hear that it didn't make the front page of the Times. That's quite remarkable. But that kind of moving on from it, or people just thinking, okay, it's another assassination attempt. Do you think that's because there's been so many now, as you say, it may well be four rather than three? Is it partly because he's Donald Trump and lots of the media classes don't like him, but is it also partly the quite dangerous prospect that Americans are getting used to their president being subjected to this kind of threat? Are we now in that kind of quite, I would say, problematic territory of becoming used to political violence? Do you think there's a part of that as well?
I think to some extent. I mean, in my day job of research political science, I mean, we see that there are periods of assassination where this sort of thing becomes almost common. I mean, in the 1960s, Martin Luther King was shot in the head, Malcolm X was shot in the head, John F. Kennedy was shot in the head in front of his wife, Robert F. Kennedy, he may have been shot in the chest, I'd have to check. But people would regularly stand on prominent stages and be shot down with deer rifles. And that affected, I mean, in terms of statistical data, that affected willingness to run for office among the business class for 20 to 30 years, in fact. And I think we may now be in another one of these periods of time. We obviously saw Charlie Kirk, I mean, a beloved figure, at least on the right. He was shot in the neck on stage. And we've seen similar tries, at least, against, someone had firebombed Josh Shapiro's house, as I recall, on the left side of things. So we may be in another one of these periods of time. I think one reason that there's a little nonchalance about this on kind of the mainstream political left is that a lot of people a lot of people on the other side of the aisle, to clarify, wanted the assassin to succeed. So, I mean, when I've talked to college audiences and asked, well, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, a lot of people will say, deplorable, horrible, but there'll be at least two or three who'll say, well, these guys need to go to the gun range This is America. We have a lot of training available. They keep missing. I mean, so there's this undertone of sardonism there where a lot of people, 20, 30% of the population probably would be pretty celebratory if Trump were killed. Trump's become almost a devil symbol for the American left. He is the evil leader of the other side. And I do think that's a risky place because obviously, last thing, but if we have President Gavin Newsom on the left, who's a 6'4" blonde, who's responsible for a lot of the trans litigation in the country, I mean, I think there'd be many people that would be just as happy to see him go. So of course you don't want people deciding, well, a good quick way to get rid of these boys is to shoot them, because then you're in a very bad public moment.
Absolutely, you really are. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the suspect, the man who's thought to have done this, Cole Thomas Allen. You've already mentioned he's mixed race. He's a graduate of Caltech, which I gather is a quite prestigious school in the US. He worked as a private tutor. He looks normal. I don't know if you can tell if someone's normal from how they look, but he doesn't look like a kind of frothing weirdo who's been on the internet his whole life. He looked quite normal in the images that I've seen. Um, there's always an attempt to figure out um, who are these people? What do they represent in American society? Are they from the left? Are they from the right? What kind of, what motors these kinds of individuals? Do you think there's anything we can say about Alan with any serious depth? Is there anything that he tells us about the state of America, or is he just a bit of a loser?
Well, I think so. A point that I've made is that by definition, people who become mass shooters or something like that are usually crazy. And I mean, I'm friends with and have dated psychologists and so on, but I don't necessarily feel a need to employ the language they would use about this and the suborn pathology. And so I think you're nuts in normal terms if you take your gun and you go shoot up a school. And so when it's said that a lot of these guys have conflicted backgrounds, I mean, one of the recent shooters, I forget which one, was a registered Republican, but had also given to some of the blue wave charities on the tune of $50 a piece. And people were debating, how could you do both? The obvious answer is that you're nuts. I mean, your background is not going to make coherent sense necessarily. Your head's a bag full of cats. So I think that that's something in the background that almost always you're going to find some kind of growing mental disorder, a collapsed romantic relationship, a lost job. In the recent past, when you look at individuals that are going to go on and do this kind of thing. With that said, though, you're absolutely right. This guy, for most of his life, was not a basement dwelling. I mean, we talked about the Reddit and 4chan communities on both Paul and Lefty Paul very briefly. He wasn't one of those guys. He graduated from Caltech, and yeah, that's a top 10 school in the USA. It's one of the few schools that admits entirely on merit, so there's probably not a DEI component here. He actually invented a stopping brake for wheelchairs, apparently. It's sort of a crude PVC pipe affair, but it's used. I mean, he's an inventor. He's just a guy. And I think that part of what makes this disturbing is that many normal people, as I just said, are becoming extremely radicalized about electoral politics. If you read the manifesto, which I forced myself to do, I've read a number of these shooter manifestos in my teaching or consulting role. One of the things that comes to mind is that he's using language directly from the Epstein files and even from the mainstream media. So there's an idea that it's pretty clear how he got quote unquote radicalized. At one point, he says the president is a rapist, he's a proven pedophile, he's a traitor. That's a verbatim quote from the tip line portion of the Epstein files. And when people
Yeah.
say Epstein files, I mean, there are actual observations by law enforcement of Jeffrey Epstein's child abuse and prostitution ring, and we know that Donald Trump and Bill Clinton were at some public-facing events, gallery openings, and so on that Epstein was involved with. Awkward. But there's also the tip line that the various law enforcement agencies kept up for several years, where people could just call in who'd gone bar hopping with former Epstein girls, many of whom at this point were sex workers with drug problems. So you have some drunk guy saying what some drunk woman told him, much of which seems completely invented. I mean, there's a piece in there about how Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Clarence Thomas, and George Bush were on a boat eating a child together. And this woman claimed to have been there to provide sexual services, and it's just complete nonsense. I mean, obviously, these tips were investigated. They were found to be totally uncorroborated. They were bluntly things drunk prostitutes said at some point. I assume everyone was of age at this time. And that kind of stuff and I'm not unsympathetic to these abused girls, but, like, that kinda stuff had gotten out into the community to the point where it's becoming a domestic and even international problem. When you talk to people in, Qatar, for example, or in France about American political affairs, they'll often say, "Well, isn't your ruling class raping and eating children?" And the answer is, of course not, no. But I think this guy had internalized some of that. Like, we do have a president that's a child rapist. He's a traitor. That's a reference to Russiagate, so on down the line. So this guy had been marinating, maybe not in the fever swamps of 4chan, but in CNN, MSNBC, and there's a lot of nonsense at almost the same level on those platforms. So that I think plays a big role for this guy in particular.
Yeah, I really noticed the Epstein influence as well, and does make you think that we might be witnessing the kind of transformation of the Epstein hysteria into its helter-skelter period, perhaps, where, some people take it as gospel and act on it in violent ways. One thing I value about talking to you, Will, is that, as you said earlier, you are a researcher, you understand numbers and other issues very well. You did some great research on the COVID lockdowns, some listeners will remember, and you've also done lots of research on hate crimes, including made up hate crimes. So I wanted to get your thoughts on what I'm seeing is always a big discussion in America, and it's hard for someone like me to make sense of it, which is the question of whether political violence is predominantly a right wing problem or a left wing problem, or perhaps both. And you'll hear almost entirely opposite views depending on the commentator who's talking. Some will say it's the far right, they're killing loads of people. Others will say it's the problem is the left. Can we say with any certainty which side Alan belonged to? And what's your view in terms of the numbers and who's most responsible for political violence in the US?
Well, Allen, I mean, was a man of the left. I mean, he was an Epstein files reader. He was a CNN watcher. I mean, he was a graduate of California academia, and I mean, everything reading between the lines of his document, looking at his family, everything indicates that. And I mean, you don't want to be glib, but the profile of interracial Caltech student from California, like the odds that you would be a rock ribbed Republican in that group are on the order of 2 to 5%, something like that. So he was a left wing guy. I believe he was a registered Democrat. I'd have to confirm that. But and by the way, that's a little different from some of the other Trump shooters. The first one, as I understand, actually was a Republican. He'd just become radicalized against Donald Trump. So it was very hard for either side to really exploit that. The second guy, the Ukraine backer and the duck blind, as I understand, was toward the left. But this guy was just a standard liberal individual. In terms of the actual question about political violence, I think the honest answer is that political violence occurs on both sides of the aisle. I will say that the normal Cato Institute sort of numbers that are used here are pretty bad. There are reasons that the methodological parameters were selected, but I don't really agree with them. So I mean, for example, you would see these reports generally say like since 9/11 most political violence has been on what we would consider the left, it's or the right. It's not Islamic, it's not leftist. That's a pretty big omission, right? I mean, so if you include 9/11, it becomes, 3,000 whatever on the left and Islamic side, and then the remaining cases on the right. So the Black Lives Matter riots aren't included in most of these databases, which is to me insane because rioting's not considered terrorism or direct assassination under US law. But the BLM riots killed easily 35 people just in the latest George Floyd round. And you also saw the previous, I mean, Michael Brown Ferguson riots, where people in Palestine were giving the city of St. Louis advice. You saw
Yeah.
the Freddie Gray riots in Baltimore, which is the people that burnt down the flagship Walgreens were dancing on the police cars. So none of that is in the data set. A final point here would be that somewhat unbelievably, prison murders are in the data set. So the data set involves members of known hate groups, this sort of thing. And the Aryan Brotherhood qualifies, which is in charge, as I understand, I haven't spent a lot of time in this environment, but of most of the white prison gangs in the USA, White Knights, Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, so on. So when someone in prison is killed over a drug debt, that's very frequently going to go down as right-wing political violence. There's no equivalent on the left where La M.A., the Mexican Mafia, or the literal Black Guerrilla Family, that's Guerilla, but those are not considered to be left-wing radical groups. So, there are a lot of issues with what we have, and even using what we have over the past 2 years, left-wing political violence has been very dominant. But, I mean, there obviously also is right-wing political violence. I mean, you've seen the Charlottesville riots, January 6th. I'd say there's less of it, but, I mean, many targeted assassinations, for example, over the years, going back to Kennedy, have been, if anything, slanted to the right. Right now, we do seem to be seeing a radicalized left that's attacking, Mr. Trump. I think that's President Trump. I think that's really, really obvious. And, as a final note about data, yes, thanks to you guys, I actually did write about COVID a fair amount, quite a bit of it for Spiked. And I think one of the articles that you, I believe, edited that I wrote was one of the early pieces that found that lockdowns weren't really working all that well because there were so many, they weren't working at all because there were so many exceptions to them, so on down the line. So if you compared, and this remained true through the end of the pandemic, if you compared regions like Sweden that didn't lock down and US states that didn't really lock down like Florida to other comparative areas, there weren't dramatic differences in deaths. And this is something that in the global kind of up middle class has been intentionally forgotten, that we sort of panicked. Really, I mean, there may have been a bit less death under the shutdown model that was employed in most big cities, but I mean, every prom in the USA, with a few exceptions, was canceled over the course of 2 years, not just 1. So you have to balance all of the negatives of what you're doing versus all of the positives, and we really did not do that with COVID-19. What we saw was fanatical hysteria, "You're gonna kill my aging father," sort of stuff, and hopefully we're not gonna make a major policy decision in that fashion again, but I couldn't guarantee that.
Yeah, it's worth people revisiting some of the stuff that you wrote for us on this question because I think about it often, that did lockdown work? And there's a lot of evidence suggests that it didn't. One more thing on the shooting thing that I wanted to ask you about was the phenomenon, or perhaps non-phenomenon, you can tell us, of trans shooters. So there does seem, to me, an outside observer of American affairs, there does seem to have been, a not insignificant number of shootings carried out by either trans identifying people or non-binary people. um, there has been a kind of undertone of violence in the trans lobby for some time. I mean, the way they talk about women, kill TERFs, hang JK Rowling, F these bitches. I mean, there's been a kind of undertone of quite misogynistic and sometimes violent language. Is the trans shooting phenomenon a real thing? Is it a problem? What's happening with trans politics in America right now?
Well, yeah, I think it's fair to say that there've recently been a very disproportionate number of trans mass shooters. I mean, you have to, if you're breaking out all age clades and not just young people, I mean, maybe 1% of the population maybe is trans. If you look at the mother, then now what I'd recommend people do with mass shootings is look at the actual list that Mother Jones and the FBI agree on. And if you're familiar again with US politics, Mother Jones Magazine and the FBI don't agree on much. But there's a full list of these. There are about 200 real mass shootings all time, which is sort of someone going mad with a gun would be a way to describe it. You kill at least 3 or 4 people or more, public place. It's not gang related. You're not wiping out your family or shooting your husband. That what people think of, Columbine, so on down the line. If you look at that pool, of the last 5 the last 20 real mass shootings, you would find that 5 or 6, again, I don't ever want to give a number I'm not absolutely sure of, but had a trans or non-binary, perpetrator. So that if you have 25% from 1%, that's remarkable. And again, this data changes every couple of years, so this would be what we're seeing right now. We could see angry black guys or white loners or something, make a resurgence again. But yeah, as of right now, like the disturbed rainbow-haired kid is maybe someone you don't want to see walk into the movie theater. And I think there's been a lot of denial of this because again, so much of this is numbers play. It's almost fencing back and forth where both the hard left because they want to remove guns from the public square in the USA and the hard right because they find that the racial numbers here are a little better for their case. Both of these groups have started using a different definition of mass shooting from the FBI definition. So what you'll often see is something like shots fired at more than two persons, or to be more fair, more than 2 to 3 people hit. But that's a huge percentage of all shootings. That's not
Yeah.
killed. That's not by a stranger, whatever you might think of that addition. That's just that you start looping in a whole bunch of gang violence and just sort of random things, accidents during hunting season. And if you do that, there you have a smaller percentage of trans shooters because something like 65% of the mass shooters become urban Black and Hispanic males that don't kill anybody. So when people say, "Well, no, there's not a trans mass shooting epidemic," what you can almost always see them do is go to this newer data from Everytown America, the anti-gun block, for example, and argue, "Well, there are 3 mass shootings a day. How many of those involve a trans perp?" The response is that, of course, there aren't 3 mass shootings a day. Every school would be a shooting gallery. That literally refers to everything that happens in urban slum neighborhoods. Again, no fatal casualties. So I'd say, yeah, basically, in one sense, if you use the real numbers, yes, there are a lot of trans people that are doing this. And I mean, you mentioned the trans movement in general, because it's a movement made up largely of men and of potentially violent young men with mental illnesses, if we're not using the polite pronouns and so on, is a potentially very violent movement. I mean, I've communicated with some people like Posey Parker, and I mean, there've been these extreme attacks at these pleasant sessions, let women speak. The women who won't weesh, if I have that term correct, a bunch of ladies going to lunch. You have people throwing metal cans of tomato soup at them and so on. And that I think has been kind of again under rugged because because of the verbal spin there. It's a clash between women, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Some of the women are just 6 feet tall with beards.
Absolutely right. That's a very good way to describe it. Will, I wanted to get your thoughts on the Southern Poverty Law Center. You mentioned the Orion Brotherhood earlier on, and I'm thinking, who's funding them? Because there has been this controversy, ongoing scandal. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, has filed charges, as far as I understand, against the Southern Poverty Law Center. Listeners will be familiar. That's a kind of, I guess you'd call it a civil rights legal outfit that keeps a check on white supremacist groups in America, hate groups, and so on. And there is this scandal that apparently some of its donors' money was going into some of these groups, at least to the extent of funding informers within those groups and not being entirely open about it. It can be a bit hard to untangle, but do you think there's something telling about this scandal? What might it tell us about, I guess, modern left politics?
Well, I think this is a very funny scandal to some extent. I mean, I know people tangentially that are involved in it. The SPLC, yes, is one of these American outfits, US based outfits. They get money from around the globe that really rose up to combat old school racism during our political and ethnic clashes in the 1950s, 1960s. The Southern Poverty Law Center was started by Morris Dees, and yeah, their goal is identifying hate groups, launching lawsuits against hate groups. They've done impressive things in the past. They've bankrupted entire Klan outfits. One of their buildings that they work out of used to be the headquarters of the United Klans of America, which is fairly badass, quote unquote. I mean, they're lawyers, the preppy black female attorneys and so on are working at the desks of the old Kliegels and Grand Dragons and other amusingly named people. But again, the most dangerous period for a radical movement is after you win. So once the Klan was bankrupted, once the Civil Rights Act was passed, I mean, many would argue there's not much for the SPLC to do. So over the past 20 years, they've devoted themselves to fundraising. I used to get a circular in the mail, and they've maintained this list of hate perpetrators in the USA, which again, as we've moved left, as we've gotten wealthier, has expanded dramatically to include people who in no way are affiliated with traditional racism. My good buddy James Lindsay is on the list. for anti-trans statements or something. I'd have to recheck his profile, but they've got a nice hidden shoulders pic of the guy on there. I haven't made it, possibly because I'm black, so it's harder to call me a Nazi. But Chaya Raichik, lives of TikTok, pleasant Jewish American woman, she's on there, and Coulter. So I mean, this is what they're doing right now, and it turns out that they're doing something else. In fact, a great deal of their money, as you mentioned, is going to groups that they identify as hate outfits, and they argue that this is to fund informants within the groups, but this isn't a police agency, so they don't get anything out of that except articles for their webpage. A cynic might note instead that what they're doing is providing a tenth or whatever it was of the funding for these groups so that hate can continue. Because obviously the SPLC has no basis for drawing in money unless there's a substantial amount of American hate. And I mean, to give a couple of these, I think it was the National Alliance, the combined group of white nationalist groups, got $1 million from them. They were the largest single funder of the Ku Klux Klan that I've been able to identify. Might be an article you guys want to do, but it was $73,000 in at least one check. I think two went to the
Wow.
KKK. And they could
Wow.
say, well, technically it went to our informant, the president of the KKK, but that money's fungible, as we see often with Israel, Gaza, so on. So this is money's flowing in directly. A few more checks of this kind. But, actually quite a few more checks of this kind. They gave $270,000 to the people that organized the Unite the Right rally, which was the Charlottesville riot, and that was a substantial percentage of the funding for that event, as I understand. So what they say is, "Well, we're paying these people to tell us what, right-wing hate mongers are doing." What I think a lot of people would say is, "Well, what you're probably doing is funding these events that allow you to keep fundraising." So, I mean, the year before Charlottesville, the SPLC had a slow fundraising year. They raised about 50 million, which is a slow year for them. This is a very large group. The year after Charlottesville, they raised $133 million. So, I mean, if you want to look at it in the most cynical possible way, they made a $270,000 investment that led to some bloody rioting between left and right. And now you can say, well, look at what a mess this country is. There's bloody rioting between left and right in the street. Well, yeah, because you paid for it. So this is an entertaining scandal. A lot of people are looking at this. The reason that we're talking about it is that Kash Patel actually had enough of it and indicted them. So the FBI, this isn't hypothetical, anything that we're saying. The FBI launched an 11-count indictment against the Southern Poverty Law Center and said, well, even if you guys are paying informants, it's radically illegal to mislead your donors, to say that money is going to things, libraries in the South or whatever it was, and then to give it to the Ku Klux Klan. So there's nothing legal about that, and we're gonna go after you. Last thing, but they also apparently set up these Enron style companies. The way the Enron fraud worked, as you probably know, is that Enron executives set up separate, basically fake shell businesses that did business with Enron. So the company would do things like trade a $20,000 block of gas futures or a worthless piece of swampland to one of their companies, in Darth Vader Ltd. Or whatever it was. And the company would then sell that back a year later for 50,000, you sell it back for 1 million and so on. And gradually you accumulated billions of dollars worth of these just useless assets. And the SPLC apparently was doing something similar where their shell company would give money to the Klan and they would then publish a piece containing the names of specific Klansmen that were revealed to them by their informant who'd just gotten paid. Some of the informants themselves were written up on the SPLC website as, very bad men, capital V, capital B, capital N. So it's a funny scandal, and the government's going after them for various fraud and malfeasance charges.
Yeah, it is a funny scandal. Worth saying that the SPLC says that the story is very different to the one that we're being told, but we will see as this plays out. Um, you describe very well how this could be a kind of money making exercise by groups like the SPLC, but do you think there's a kind of moral imperative as well? Because I'm thinking about some of the stuff that you've done on Jussie Smollett, for example, our favorite hate crime faker. And you've written about fake hate crimes on campuses as well, because I guess when victimhood or suffering becomes the social currency of off the left, and not only off the left, but kind of in social spaces in society, being a victim is the way you move ahead, get funding, etc., etc. Is there a possibility that this is like an institutional version of that, where you create hate in order to give yourself a moral mission in life?
Yeah, I think that's what we've both been implying, and as you said, that hasn't been proven, but they will literally get a chance to tell it to the judge, right? I mean, they're gonna be in front of some no-nonsense Southern jurist pretty soon. Yeah, I would tend to suspect that that's what happened. So the usual motivation for a hate crime hoaxer, a few of them are just insurance fraudsters, but the usual motivation is to, quote, unquote, "call attention to a real problem."
Mm,
I mean, I found this in a huge chunk of the cases I was looking at. Here at the University of Michigan, we have an extreme problem with racism, so I'm going to call that out by falsifying an incident, sort of thing. Now, the question, of course, would be if you did have a huge problem with institutional racism at the University of Michigan, why were there no real hate crimes? Very often, with a lot of these colleges that I looked at, every incident that was unpacked that occurred on campus, when I unpacked it, turned out to be fraud. On one occasion, and this actually was a trans-identified woman, but the person in charge of some kind of campus anti-hate agency was going around the campus posting flyers that said things like "trannies go home." So there was an institutional component to this. I don't know whether that was approved or not, but we are going to demonstrate how bad we are, and then we're gonna take action against the badness, and the
yeah.
person responsible for the badness is the person in charge of the action. Yeah, there's quite probably some of that. The one piece that comes to mind is an article that I read years ago in a business class about, volunteer firefighters being very prone to set fires. So if you're a voluntary part-time firefighter, the 2 things you do are, 1, go to work at Walmart or whatever your regular job is and make $10 an hour, 1, and 2, be a firefighting hero, and most of these guys do get paid, so make maybe $25 an hour putting out blazes and getting cheered by the ladies of the town. So there's a strong incentive to drive the fire truck instead of just schlep off to work every day. And when off, these people often go up into the hills and set things ablaze. So it's the same kind of thing now. Like if your job is putting out fires, even in this case, if there's social or spiritual fires, there have to be fires, or you just have to go home and become a country divorce lawyer again. So somebody's probably going to make that fire happen. Awkward, incentive based, but real.
Yeah, that's I did not know that about volunteer firefighters. That is fascinating and makes sense. Well, my last question for you is just, I mean, you've kind of touched on this already with all the things that we've been talking about, but I wanted to just ask you for a brief comment on, I guess, the state of the culture war in the US. Because here in Britain, it kind of ebbs and wanes. One minute it's the only thing everyone's talking about, the next minute it kind of disappears for a while. What's it like in the US? Is it petering out, getting worse? How is the kind of, I guess, what we might call the woke wars, the culture war? How is that playing out right now?
Well, we're in an interesting place, and I try to avoid plugging things during interviews, but I actually started a business recently related to this. It's called Unified Solutions America. You can Google that name or check out our website, unifiedsolutionsamerica.com. But the point of this is that our focus actually is removing DEI from corporations. I talked to some potential clients over the years. There's a fairly major market for this where you go through corporate material with an AI tool and basically take out all the nonsense that's been added since 2010. And there are practical ways to track that. I mean, what's the length of the guide to your business? What's the frequency of pronoun use among your executive employees? Was that mandated? So there's almost, again, an amusing element to it. But you go in, you take this stuff out. I mean, we were working with people like Local Distance, James Lindsay. You explain what's been happening. Where did these bizarre theories that have been impacting your business come from? And then you replace the ideology with merit. But getting to the point, the reason that there's a market for USA, what a name, is that the left wing ratchet generally only turns in one direction, right? So that's something people have been saying since the 60s. But what it means in practice in political science is that you tend to see revolutionary movements progress until they meet kind of that wall of suburban moms and dads and, off duty soldiers and other taxpayers, farmers that just won't put up with it anymore. And then the movement stops. but the movement stops close to the high water point that it reached. So the next movement is going to begin from there. And
Yeah.
our goal at the business is winding this back, pulling the stuff out of companies. But I think that that first point is where we mostly are with DEI, the pronoun stuff, LGBT issues, so on in the USA. Right now, people are very, very irritated with this stuff and are significantly backlashing to the point where you actually see, for example, fewer middle class girls identifying as trans or non binary or bisexual, which I think is good. I mean, most of these people do not have developed sexual identities at 14, one would imagine. So you're saving yourself potentially from some damaging surgeries and this kind of thing. But so people are very, very irritated with this stuff, but the infrastructure remains. So when for the company we've gone into these businesses and we've looked at, or is the DEI substrate still there? What we found is that generally, like, the vice president of diversity has been rebranded something like the vice president of friendship. It's these very Orwellian titles, but the people are all still there. Less than 5% of them had been let go, easily less than 5%. So I think that's where we are. Like, we're at a moment of quiet. The right one, basically. I mean, thanks in large part to you guys in the UK, but the trans issue reached so far and no higher, and that's now being knocked down. I mean, the gender clinics are closing in the USA as well. But the core issues, like, has the Supreme Court redefined sex so that there really isn't a definition of woman anymore? And are we gonna have to fight that out over court cases for the next 20 years? That's all still there. So I think that's where we are, that we have the same people in companies, but they're no longer doing DEI, they're doing head count friendship. We have the same laws on the books, but for the next 10 years, they'll be enforced so that you can sue as a white or an Asian or a male as well. But the core issue, if you want to go for a victory, now I wouldn't repeal the Civil Rights Act. There are all kind of downsides of that. But for most of this stuff, like, victory would be getting rid of the senior VP of whatever in the first place. Like, the anti-DEI, anti-woke movement would look a lot like what you saw with Elon Musk at Twitter, where he came in and I think he did a good, fair businessman's job. He reviewed what everyone did. It took him a month. And then he fired entire divisions of the company, sort of new HR, DEI, ESG, SEL, all the alphabet soup was gone immediately. But then other things, like most of marketing, more than half of it was fired because they didn't do anything. And what you wound up with was sort of engineering and sales and some executives. And I think that's how a lot of businesses should look. And there's a governmental equivalent of that as well. So I think right now we're at the period where we see, are the people on the right and the center right going to pursue that until we sort of musk whole sectors of society? Or are we going to go back to playing T-ball with the kids? And that's always the risk on the right. I mean, when you when something pisses off the left, this is an old line from PJ O'Rourke, you see a mob in the streets, attacking Goldman Sachs and fighting the young bankers, and you see people screaming on TV with rainbow hair, and you have protest songs written. When something pisses off the right, you see two members of Young Americans for Freedom standing there with a 6-inch American flag because we have jobs. So are we going to go back to them? That, I think, is what the opposition is hoping for.
Will, thank you very much.